which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that is dedicated to the creation of a spacefaring civilization with chapters around the world. It's time to introduce our panelists. Myself, I'm Jim Plaxco, your moderator and president of the Chicago Society for Space Studies. We have James Barnard, who is president of the Denver Space Society, Clifford McMurray, president of the Oklahoma Space Alliance, Bryce Meyer of the St. Louis Space Frontier, and Seth Potter, who is going to unfortunately be a little bit late in joining us due to a doctor's appointment. And now let me see if I can get this straight. Seth is president of the Organization for the Advancement of Space Industrialization and Settlement. And now you can understand why people simply call it OASIS, much less challenging. If you're interested in learning more about the chapters that each of our panelists are associated with, here are the relevant chapters in their websites. And I'll be pasting links for all of this into the chat area once we get going. And for those of you who are not familiar with NSS and its chapters, we're actually, as chapters, we're an international grassroots network of people working to promote space exploration, space development, and space settlement. And we do this via local educational presentations, local exhibits, meeting with elected officials to explain our view on space policy issues to them. So before we begin our actual discussion, here are some disclaimers. Third on the list, the views expressed here are the personal views of our panelists and are not necessarily those of either their chapters or the National Space Society. 2, if you have a question you would like to ask, please use the Zoom Q&A feature, which is in your toolbar that should be at the bottom of your screen. And we're going to try and get to as many questions as we can, but unfortunately, we cannot guarantee that we'll get to your question. 1, please be respectful with your questions and with one another when using the Q&A feature and the chat. And now it's time for liftoff. And I didn't share my screen on any of that, did I?
No, you forgot to, Jim.
I forgot to. Well, it was all going to wind up, it's all going to wind up in the chat anyway. So let me hit up our panelists with the first question of the evening. In 2002, Futron released their space tourism market study, which they updated in 2006. Now, in 2006, they predicted that by 2016, a total of 4,000 tourists would have flown in space. And they saw that number as rising to 15,000 by the end of 2021. Well, we're now at the end of 2020 and we're still at the count of 0. So my question for the panel is, what the heck happened? So who would like to take their first stab on that question?
Well,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Cliff.
Go ahead.
All right. Our former executive director of NSS and longtime CEO of Virgin Galactic, although he's recently stepped down to a different position in the organization, George Whitesides is forever saying space is hard, space is hard, space is hard. And indeed it is hard. We have had 8. I mean, come on, we've made some progress. We've had 8 tourist flights to ISS, and we would have had more than that by now, except for the fact that the shuttle stopped flying. And when the shuttle stopped flying, we all those positions that the Russians were selling to tourists had to go to NASA astronauts to populate the space station and keep the crew up to its full crew size. So now that NASA has an option for getting its own crew to space station with Crew Dragon, the Russians are again offering tourist flights to ISS. We're going to have one next year with 2 people, and there's another one scheduled in 2023 with another 2 tourists, that one of which will be the first tourist spacewalker off the space station with any luck at all. So that's the slow progress that's being made in orbit. Now, as to suborbital, if you had told me or told anybody else back in the first few years of the 2000s after the X Prize was won, that we would still be sitting here 15 years later without any suborbital tourism, I don't think anybody would have believed you. It's just a remarkable thing that it's taken that long and been that hard a road.
I think one of the couple of the things, one has been money, investment capital coming in from investors that are a little bit concerned about their investment, and 2, the technology. And the cost for tickets is so high right now that very few people except millionaires and billionaires can afford it. And it won't be until the costs come way down that you'll see an increase in tourism. It's one thing to, I think it's one thing to, to talk about these flights on the shuttle and on the Soyuz and what have you as tourist flights. That's true, but they're basically filling 1 spare seat or 2 spare seats. And I think tourism really won't take off until you've got much lower ticket prices.
Well, those upcoming flights that I mentioned, Russian flights on Soyuz are going to be dedicated tourist flights. They will have a pilot, but he will be flying for the sole purpose of delivering tourists to the space station. So I think that's significant.
Bryce, did you have any angle on this issue? You're muted, Bryce. Bryce, we don't hear you.
Sorry. I think you only had like 2 platforms really that offer suborbital flights, right? You had the Virgin Galactic and you have a Blue Origin ship, and the Blue Origin ship has yet to fly anybody up that high. So really you've only had one that's even sent anybody up. And like you've mentioned before, the motor problem seems to be an issue with Virgin Galactic right now. And Blue Origin hasn't gotten that far in their test program yet. So really you don't have any platform for suborbital. As far as orbital goes, you only have one commercial ride up, and that's the Crew Dragon, and it hasn't even finished its test profile yet. But even once you have that, you really don't have any place to go other than the ISS. Right now, you just have the ISS. The 3 space hotel companies that were out there have all folded for the most part, and then Bigelow just in March laid off their entire staff, though they did have something that was already attached to the ISS. So I think one of the drivers is you really need a place to go, and you still need vehicles to get there. Now, I think once the vehicle traffic increases, as the next couple of years increase, you'll start seeing a lot more push for people to at least want to go up and do a looky-loo trip. But until you get something that's cruise liner size, like a Starship, something along those lines, it'll still be a game for really billionaires.
Now, with respect to the challenges to the suborbital market at this time, they've got competitors with the few companies out there that are now offering the very high altitude balloon flights. I believe Whirlwind is one, and there's another one. There's another one out of Spain as well. Now, granted, instead of going to the 300,000 feet that qualifies for going into space, they're only going to 100,000 feet. Do you think the success of those businesses is going to help or hurt the market for suborbital flights?
Well, I think that they're different experiences. The advantage to a balloon flight from a tourist standpoint is that it's not just up and down in 20 minutes. You're going to be able to sit there and look at black sky and curved horizon for a couple of hours. On the other hand, you don't get the weightless experience unless, as some of the balloon flights we're talking about, they drop the crew cabin and let it free fall for a while before they pop a parachute on it. Now, I don't know if any of them are still talking about doing that or not, or whether they've decided that that's not going to be sufficiently safe for them to do it that way. But given that it's a different experience and given that it's significantly cheaper, the price tag I saw for Worldview was $75,000 versus, well, Virgin Galactic started off at $200,000, and in 2013 it upped its ticket price without even having its first flight to $250,000. Now they're talking about raising the price again to $300,000. So the difference between $75,000 and $250,000 to $300,000 is significant. I think there will be at least a few people that will choose a cheaper experience, but ultimately, I think that the two are not going to compete with each other too drastically.
Okay, now we've all been following, and I want to welcome Seth Potter from the OASIS chapter. Welcome.
Hey, Jim. Sorry I'm late. I'm gonna, if it's feasible, you may not want to interrupt, but I'm getting some feedback from some late registrants that they've been locked out of Eventbrite. They can no longer get in.
Ticket sales ended a couple of hours ago.
Okay. Nothing can be done.
Everyone who had registered for the event was sent an email with the Zoom registration information.
Okay.
So
no way to reopen it, is there?
Not right now, no.
Okay.
Well, now we've all been following the space tourism industry for some time. So if we were to decide to start our own space tourism business, whether it's orbital or suborbital, what do you see as being the principal challenges to any group that would want to get into this industry?
Got an extra 100 million lying around somewhere?
That reminds me of the old line is, how do you make $1 million in the space launch industry? You start out with $1 billion.
Yeah.
Yep.
O-N-E-Y,
Pardon me?
money.
Yes, money. What about the time to market? It seems that, I mean, look at how many years Virgin Galactic has been at it, and they have, granted they had advanced ticket sales, but they're about, what, 7 years behind schedule at this point. X-Core Aerospace, who I thought had a really good business model and would probably be the first to fly, is now out of business.
It's been a much cooler ride.
Yes, it would have been. Yes, so so we've got capital requirements, we've got the time to market, because it takes significant time to develop this. Now, what about regulation? Now, here in the United States, the Federal Aviation Administration is responsible for the licensing of spacecraft and the operations of those space tourism companies. So what's your take on the regulatory environment in which a space tourism business would have to operate here in the US?
I would, well, in the first place, it does take a long time, I think, and the FAA just recently gained that role. And so it's not quite as easy as getting an FAA certification for an airliner, for example, right? They haven't refined it to that level yet, I don't think. And so they really need to at least get to the point where it's like checking off an airliner, and even getting an FAA cert for an airliner takes a long time. So if it's going to take that long as it does for an airliner, you're still 5 or 6 years out for an FAA certification, unless you're willing to license it as an experimental craft. Now, I think that's how they've been doing it so far, is theoretically you can do it as an experimental craft, and then you have a much shorter time frame. The other side, of course, is what happens the first time you crash then, right? So if it's an experimental craft, well, then, you know, it's bon chance, right? But if you decide to license it as an airliner, now you have to worry about the insurances and liabilities that go with that. So that's going to be more of a problem for something, let's say, Starship sized, right? Or something more, maybe a Crew Dragon +3, you know, or something along those lines, right? Once you get those craft going up a lot, then you're going to get to the point where you're really going to have to start worrying about somebody who's not just an adventurer, right? Somebody who's a genuine tourist and expects some level of safety on the way up and down.
Well, the FAA has the government in the person of the FAA has done something that is both wonderful and wise, which is to say that they're not going to certify the vehicles early on because they don't have the experience to certify them.
Right.
I mean, just imagine today trying to certify the Spirit of St. Louis or the Wright Flyer. They're not certifiable because they're not up to current safety standards. But at the time, they were the best you could do. And you learned over time how to build safe vehicles and how to understand that they were safe. So until 2023, the FAA is not going to put any particular safety regulations in place unless there is an accident, in which case they will presumably make some regulatory findings in terms of specific to that accident and what needs to be done to correct that. But in the meanwhile, they're going to stand back and watch. And the only requirement they have for the companies right now is informed consent, which is
right.
That if you're going to fly on this thing, on your own head be it. You need to understand that it's a risky thing to do, just as it was in the early days of aviation. And if you want to take that risk, it's your business. There are a lot of people, if you've climbed Mount Everest today, you're going to be hiking by the bodies of people who signed informed consent decrees and died on the way up or on the way down.
Right, exactly.
You know, there's I may be jumping ahead a little bit, but there's one issue that kind of impacts a lot of the barriers, regulatory, launch costs, you know, the financial, and that is reliability. And the reason I say that is because when you, I think something like, you know, 1% of rockets will blow up on the pad or will fail in some catastrophic way, something, you know, maybe it's a little higher, maybe it's a little lower. We need to get that to on the order of, well, commercial airliners are 1 in 2 million, I believe, per.
I don't think you're going to get there.
Yeah, but you might want to aim for, let's say, 1 in 10,000. The reason I say reliability is it's not just the people in the vehicle that you have to worry about, but it's crashing into someone on the ground or at sea. Right now, every time there's a launch out of the Cape or out of Vandenberg, there's a long process of clearing the range, and ships and planes have to be, you know, out of the area. And we, you know, in order to, you know, get launch costs down, you need flight rates up. In order to get flight rates up, you need reliability to get up. Once you do that, economies of scale will flow. The insurance liability.
We've lost you, Seth.
Okay, I don't know what happened.
There we go. You seem to be.
Well, I guess that's all I have to say. Yeah. Do you still hear me?
Now
Now again, yes.
Okay,
Looks like you had a band.
looks like I'm back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we talked a little bit about, whether or not the high altitude balloon business whether it would help or hurt the suborbital business. But now we also have a question of, let's say with SpaceX and Blue Origin efforts, they will be able to either take passengers on orbital flights, whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4 orbits, as well as the possibility of delivering tourists to a way station in space, whether it's ISS or a purely commercial successor. So how do you see these different markets interacting with one another? Is the price differential large enough that the suborbital business doesn't have to worry about the orbital business? Will the orbital business help the suborbital business by offering people a way of getting their feet wet first? What are your thoughts on that?
Again, money depends on the price of the ticket. It's going to be a lot different between taking a boat halfway down the Mississippi River and taking a week-long or 2-week-long ocean cruise. It just depends on what the going rate is. And going as far as the balloons are concerned, I think that's apples and oranges. There'll be people that'll go for that at 75,000, and if they want a suborbital ride and they can get it for whatever, 125,000 or 250 or whatever, and then for a trip to the space station or somebody else's station up there, it just depends on who's willing to pay what for what.
I think, Jim, you're right in that I think the bottleneck is how close are these price points. I think, although I've heard some arguments otherwise, I think that the difference between a suborbital flight like Virgin Galactic and a truly orbital flight, the technical difficulties of full orbit are so much greater that it's always going to be much more expensive, especially if you're comparing just a pop-up trajectory. When it comes to, say, flights, these point-to-point, surface-to-surface trajectories, like going from North America to Asia in an hour and that sort of thing, that's kind of difficult. I did some of the analysis, and it turns out that once you go more than a certain distance, I think 4,000 kilometers suborbitally, at that point, it's almost the same energy requirement of going into orbit. Of course, the problem is you have to bring it back, which is very difficult. So I think a pop-up trajectory like Virgin Galactic versus full orbit, I don't see them competing with each other. One is going to have a much lower price point. One thing about the high altitude balloon, as opposed to the even a suborbital flight, there I could see the two of them kind of impinging on each other. But one difference is I suspect that the medical requirements for the balloon flight are going to be much less stringent, and there may be a much greater market for it.
Well, if you look at historic ticket prices for suborbital versus orbital, I mean, we do have some data points, what Virgin Galactic is selling its suborbital ticket for, and what the Soyuz spaceflight participants have paid for a ride to ISS. And it's 100 times more expensive to ride on a Soyuz than it is on Virgin Galactic whenever Virgin Galactic flies. So yeah, those I think there will be some whetting of the appetite for orbital flight, but I question how many of the people that take suborbital flights and can afford that can make a 100 times ticket price jump to the more expensive ride.
Now, I believe that one of the panelists talked about, the advanced preparations that have to be made in order to have a launch. And as I recall, the Mojave Airport, where Spaceship One launched from back in 2004, I believe it took them 5 years as an existing airport to get a license from the FAA that would allow Spaceship One to launch from that airport. And if you think about it, you know, without these major airports, we wouldn't have the large scale commercial air transportation that we do today. So what's going to be up with spaceports? We have one here in the US, you know, this out in New Mexico. So what do you see their role as being in terms of a degree of importance in the success of a space tourism industry?
Well, somebody brought up somewhere I was reading brought up the point that you have certain military, National Guard and whatever, right alongside commercial airport. And as a matter of fact, I saw something today where one of the space ports down in Florida is talking about maybe they can merge with Kennedy Space Center or Cape Canaveral. And you know, it's gonna take time. It's going to take a lot of investment money, and it's going to take the government approval on all of this. But if you look at the aviation industry, how big and how long was the jump had World War II not come along? How big was the jump from small airports to O'Hare and Hartsfield and whatever? It's just going to take time, and undoubtedly the FAA or whoever the licensing agency is going to move slowly because they want to protect their backsides. And you're going to see some foot dragging, I'm sure. But, you know, it's going to be the difference between navigating by dead reckoning and navigating by commercial airways and so forth. Undoubtedly, as we get technology increases, reliability increases, frequency of flights increase. We say, oh, we've only got Cape Canaveral to launch and then Mojave. Well, SpaceX is going to build their own down on the Texas Gulf Coast. And, you know, as much clout as Musk seems to be getting, he ought to be able to get it done and licensed.
One of the issues that spaceports are going to have is integration into the national airspace.
Mm-hmm.
Now we've had several spaceports certified already, and some of them are at existing airports, some of them are not. I don't think you're going to see any suborbital flights out of existing airports for a while, for the simple reason that they want to conduct them away from other traffic for the time being. So hence the Spaceport America that Virgin Galactic encouraged to be built in New Mexico. And boy, the people who funded that have sure been waiting a long time to see a payoff on their investment. But here in Oklahoma, we have a certified spaceport. And the nice thing that we advertise about that is that it's got a FAA cleared launch corridor all to itself. It doesn't have to worry about interfacing with other aspects of the National Air Traffic Control System because it's got that corridor approved. That's not true for Spaceport America. They sit right up against a military operations area, or what is referred to as a MOA, and they're going to have to be worried about getting clearance for every flight they take, I believe.
I think I want to underscore Cliff's point. the thing about spaceports is location, location, and location. It's a real estate issue, and it's a launch. Goes back to what I said before. It's a launch range issue. Right now, there's only so many places in the world you can even have a space launch. You generally want to be on the east coast of whatever landmass you're on, or be surrounded by lots of open desert or someplace you won't fall on anybody. You want to be out of the airspace. The point about the airspace is well taken. And I think we have a few pilots among the panelists. I know of at least one. Yes. Yeah, I was thinking of you, Cliff. Cliff, you might know about this. I seem to remember that the airspace around the LA terminal control area is so complicated that you can actually buy a plastic model of it at Sporty's pilot shop. I mean, it's like, it's the usual inverted wedding cake, but like corridors where the general aviation aircraft go through, and then or sneak under some of the tiers. And it's very difficult to represent clearly on an aeronautical chart. It's that complicated. And so I think that they're gonna need to secure locations where, again, and it goes back to the first issue, regulatory, you don't want to have to cope with air traffic, military or civilian or otherwise. And I think that because even for some of the very wealthy, especially going to orbit, the trip to space may be a once or twice in a lifetime event. It's just like taking a cruise. I might, if I'm going to go on a cruise to Europe, I might fly to the East Coast just to get on the ship to cross the Atlantic. People are going to be willing to travel. Having said that, somebody that wealthy, their time is valuable, and a stray aircraft wanders into the airspace and a launch gets scrubbed, and they have to recycle the range, and depending on what kind of fuel they're using, it's a big deal. And all of a sudden they can't go that week. They might not be able to. Their company may not be able to do without them, or Elon Musk is not going to hang around watching videos. He's a bad example. He's a provider of the service, but some people we could probably think of are their time is just too valuable, and you want reliability, not just technical, but you want to know that when you show up at the spaceport, your vehicle is going to take off when it's scheduled.
Right.
Going a little bit off topic here, because this has been a sore point with me. And it just seems to me that the media has, consistently focused on just the glamorous tourist aspect of the suborbital launch business, while ignoring the plans that these businesses have made to provide flights that are dedicated to conducting zero-G experiments, which really fill a void in our ability to do zero-G research. It's typically either you use a sounding rocket or you have to fly all the way up to the International Space Station. So my question for the panelists is, what does space tourism mean for science? Are there going to be economies of scope that will be able to be of benefit to the field of zero-G scientific research?
I think there'll be piggyback situations. If you're going to fly, okay, let's say on a suborbital, and you've got one or two passengers. Now, if they're strictly tourists, that doesn't mean that you can't have either a third experimenter or just a experiment that doesn't need to be tended. And I think you'll see that will go a long way to ameliorate the costs. I think there'll be that, and I think there also will be aspects of, using some of the tourists as guinea pigs with their permission, obviously. But you say, hey, you're going along, you might as well let us maybe draw some blood or check your heartbeat or whatever, or just for more data points. So
And
I
some
think
tourists
that
would be very willing to do that in order to to have their ride subsidized. You know, you might have experimenters paying the tourists for their participation in biomedical experiments and so on.
If you remember what Richard Garriott in his one of his dinner talks at ISDC a couple of years ago, I think it was one in LA in 08, and he said he paid, I guess in those days it was $20 million to go on ISS, and he got paid something like $5 million by a pharmaceutical company to conduct experiments on the International Space Station. He didn't even use the term tourist, he used the term private spaceflight participant. And so what he was speculating is if we can ever get through, I guess, either technology or economies of scale or both, if the ticket were reduced from $20 million to $1 million for a ride to orbit, all of a sudden anyone who goes to orbit can come out $4 million ahead. Well, not quite, because the experiment costs money. But do you see what I'm getting at? It's I mean, the example is, look at the background picture behind me. You know, there's no dedicated flight to Arecibo. You just book a flight to San Juan and drive for an hour and a half. And I think a few of us did that on a bus a few years ago, which is how I got the picture. And so basically there's 2 or 3 ways I think that space tourism will enable science. One is, actually, I'll start with number 3 first. Number 3 is just the general development of a space infrastructure. Instead of having to take an expensive dedicated flight to this government facility, you just piggyback on the tourism infrastructure, because sometimes all you need is zero-G environment and a relatively clean place to conduct an experiment. And I could see, for example, that just as hotels now have convention space and meeting rooms, so space hotels are going to have spaces that you can rent for professional or scientific activities. So you'll have your recreational tourists, and then you'll have, you know, a convention floor dedicated to when we actually have an ISDC in orbit, and then you'll have some facilities that scientific institutions can rent out, and maybe even some of them will want to build their own, and this could lead to, and I'm not the first to use the term, space business parks in orbit or in cislunar space in general. That was number 3. Number 1 is, and I think, Jim, you were alluding to it, is that the upper atmosphere and the ionosphere are kind of, they're sort of no man's land, where they're too high for aircraft and too low for orbital craft, because you can't sustain an orbit there. And granted, you have sounding rockets, but what if you did have this this tethered balloon, or something like an extended range version of Spaceship Two, where you can actually fly around for a couple of 100 kilometers and have a little bit more time in that upper atmosphere, and then looking way ahead, and where you learn operations in that middle regime that hasn't been kind of inhabited before. And then I think I promised you, I had in mind, I said number 3, and then I jumped back to number 1, and there was a number 2 in there someplace. And I think that's going to be, well, I think some of the other panelists alluded. One thing we don't know is, we know that extended time in 0G is bad for you, and we know that 1G is good for you. We don't know what, if any, is the threshold below 1G. Can people live on 1/6 G on the moon, or in 39% of a G on Mars for an extended period? We don't know that. So if you can have a rotating habitat, or just a single tethered module with a counterweight, you can experiment with different levels of gravity and test out habitation on other bodies.
Well,
I was gonna say that Bryce had a point about building a hotel. In order to build a hotel, let's say on the moon, if Hilton or Marriott or some Bigelow or somebody decides they're going to build a hotel on the moon for the tourist trade, well, what does that entail? That's going to entail some pretty sophisticated building techniques. Do we build it on the surface? Do we burrow in underneath? Do we go to a lava tube? And that in itself is going to provide more experience for when we get to the moon, when we get to Mars and so forth. It's going to be a process, sure, and it may take another 50 years, but it's got to be done, and somebody will do it. And believe me, you know, they're talking about the limitations maybe of the space treaty and so forth and so on. Believe me, if some high-powered, like maybe even Musk, some highfalutin guy says I'm going to do it, and the FAA or somebody says no, you can't do that, and he's going to thumb his nose at it and do it.
Well, honestly, it won't. It'll be much simpler than that. The fact is, the United States is in competition for lunar real estate right now. That game is already afoot, right? China's already said they consider the moon as the same as they consider those islands, right, over in the South China Sea. They consider that in the same category, right? Strategically important assets that they must put stuff on. And so, honestly, for a military and strategic purposes, we need to do that. But the biggest driver in hotel revenue, and this is why a lot of hotels are getting stung right now, and the same with the airlines, is the biggest chunk of travel is business travel, right? It's not tourism. Tourism doesn't drive the airlines and it doesn't drive the hotels. Now, what is driven by tourism is cruise ships. So a cruise ship costs about $1.4 billion to build. That's with a B. Right, a Starship for the first one will be 200 billion or 2 billion, and the rest will be a whole lot cheaper. But even if you had some other incumbent come along, you know, if you could build a ship for $1 billion, that's a cruise ship in their mind, even if you can only put 100 people on it. So that economy of scale for tourism should exist pretty quick once you get that kind of ship, whether it's China or the US or whoever builds that. But backing off from that, your lunar hotel, of course, right? If you're going to build the infrastructure to support a hotel with a couple of posh tourists in the front, you might have room for, you know, a dozen tourists in the front, but you'll probably have hardcore quarters for 200 in the back for your various business tourists or scientific tourists that are paying day there to do whatever research they're engaged in, right? Whether it's a factory or whether it's looking at observations or whatever, right? So any hotel interest that we're going to build is going to have to think ahead of time and go, how can I also attract that corporate trip on top of the fat tourists that are going to be visiting too, right?
Well, we've talked in terms of the benefits to scientists. I think that we also should mention what a boon this stuff is going to be to engineering research. Now, the Virgin Galactic Craft and Blue Origin are already selling experimental space aboard their vehicles. They're already bringing revenue in from that. In the case of Virgin Galactic, they can stack 4 space shuttle lockers, experiment lockers, in the space of 1 passenger seat. And each one of those lockers goes for $50,000 to $100,000 a piece. And you can fit more than 1 experimental payload in each one of those lockers. So you're talking about experiment costs, whether they be science experiments or engineering experiments, that could cost as little as $10,000. Now, think about what that does for college students who are spending their entire engineering apprenticeships in college designing things that never get to fly because it's too expensive to fly them. All of a sudden, they get to have the experience of testing them out for real and seeing how they perform, and maybe even doing iterative tests by flying it more than once. And that's going to be a huge boon to engineering students. It's going to whet the appetite of people going into those fields to work in the space field. It's just going to be tremendous.
Well, I think what you've talked about there already exists, right? A lot of engineering students in college nowadays do a CubeSat as part of their 4-year project.
But it doesn't cost $10,000. It costs more than $10,000 to fly it, for sure.
Oh yeah. But I'm talking about, you know, if you have a set of 30 students for 4 years, Then you get to the point where they might get a subsidized share ride with somebody. But I think you need to think beyond that. So here's the one that'll twist your head a bit and that will require humans to be up there. So let's say you have a bunch of 3D printers and you're going to make Raman amplifiers, which is what 3 or 4 of those experiments on the ISS are doing, because you can only get the right crystallization for that kind of fiber amplifier up there. The other thing to consider is the fact that all the fiber in the ground ages out in 2 to 3 decades, and most of it was laid in the early 90s. So at some point, that whole infrastructure on the ground has to be replaced, and you might as well replace it with a Raman amp that's made in space, where you only need 1 of those for every 100 of the old style. So that's one business case that will quickly be closed. And in order to do that, you're going to need somebody that's up there to feed the 3D printers and then take the stock and drop it back into a ship that can come back, bring it back down for use, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's that's sort of like where you start getting the business traveler aspect of the whole problem, right? That's just one case of thousands that are out there and possible.
Gentlemen, I had several more questions on my list, but we are already at almost 10 minutes to the hour, and I haven't even gotten to any audience questions yet. So I'm going to throw out the rest of the questions that were on my list, because I want to focus on getting to questions we've been asked by the audience. I'm going to start with a question from Barbara, who asks, what are the Asians doing on tourism? So are we aware of any Asian-based space tourism enterprises?
Well, one of our NSS members, I believe the president of the NSS chapter in Japan, has a business, Astrax, that does zero-G flights. And they're a heck of a lot cheaper than the flights that are offered here in the States. So you might want to consider taking a flight to Japan just to take a zero-G.
Clifford, you might want to, for folks who aren't aware of what that is, you might want to expand on what a zero-G flight is.
Well, basically, NASA started training its astronauts back in the 60s with a vehicle which was most picturesquely referred to as the Vomit Comet. Because if you fly enough of these parabolas, what you do is you take an airplane, a regular airplane, and you stand it up on its head and you go up basically to stall speed, and then you drop the nose and let it fall to close to its maximum design velocity. The time in between that stall speed and your Vmax gives you somewhere between 10 and 30 seconds of weightlessness. And you can do that over and over again. Claire and I did that, and it's a lovely experience, and we didn't get sick. You need to take your anti-nausea meds, because again, enough of those parabolas will make you sick if you're not on anti-nausea meds. But it's a much cheaper experience than suborbital flight, even though it's not as cool. It's at least a starting point, and it's something that any reasonably well-heeled middle-class person can afford and really should do.
And one of our former NASA astronauts or payload specialists, Brian Lichtenberg, in conjunction with Peter Diamandis, started a zero-G flight business here in the United States that is still in operation.
Right.
Had a question from Ian talking about Elon Musk's idea of launching from the sea. So do you see that there's a possibility for sea-launched space tourist flights?
Could very well be. The concept was initiated back in 1962 by R.C. Truax out at Aerojet Sacramento, whom I was fortunate enough to work for as a summer hire in college. And it was called Sea Dragon, and the idea was to take this huge booster and manufactured in a shipyard, tow it out into the ocean, erect it, and launch it and take it off. And so you look up Sea Dragon and see what that was about. But yeah, it could work. Right now, SpaceX is landing on their barges. You know, whether or not you could do it by taking off from a larger barge or whatever. But whatever man can conceive of, chances are eventually somebody will do it. And it would
And
eliminate
yeah,
the problem of infrastructure on land.
I think it could possibly be somebody's business case. I mean, anything that takes off from a runway, it's not going to work. But I'm thinking that the Proton rocket, which was part of the Sea Launch Company's, which was their launch vehicle, that was a pretty big rocket. And I don't remember its payload capability, but I can see, I could see somebody looking into it. My gut feeling is it's not going to be what ultimately closes the business case in the most economical way, but somebody might pull it off.
Another question from one of our attendees, from Donald. How soon could there be a space hotel along the lines of the one depicted in the movie 2001?
That one's a ways off, I think. A space motel, something on a space Winnebago, I think is probably going to happen within the next 10 to 15 years. But it's not going to be on the scale of the space station in 2001.
I'll give you the bad news and the good news. The bad news is, if you're looking to do something like 2001 with a rotating habitat, there's two challenges, which 2001 may look rather easy, but granted they had a story to tell in 2 hours and 45 minutes to do it. And that is docking with a rotating habitat. And this is something that doesn't come up too much. There's basically, that's one problem. And I do things in three. So number two, so docking is number one. Number two, which you don't hear a lot about, is precessing the axis around the Earth once per orbit. Depending on the exact geometry of the thing, the angular momentum vector is going to tend to want to keep pointing in the same direction in inertial space. But on the other hand, if the thing is long enough, it might tend to align, you know, like a cylinder, it might tend to align with the Earth's gravity gradient. So you'll have these two forces fighting each other. And so the dynamics of this have to be worked out. And then the third problem, here's where the good news comes in. Some of you might be familiar with some papers or a paper by Al Globus, where he data mined some earlier work on the human vestibular sense and how sensitive is the inner ear to rotation. And it turns out that for most people, we are less sensitive than previously thought, which means that a rotating habitat could be made smaller. You generally want to make them big, so you don't have to rotate them as fast. But it turns out you can rotate them smaller, and the scale of things really gets a lot smaller. And so I think we might have something like that in 10, 20 years, but it wouldn't be nearly on the scale of what's in 2001.
Last question, because we are essentially out of time. I'm going to try to combine several different questions from Pablo and Stelios. And those have to do with, let's say, the price trend. How are prices going to be moving down? When will flights become affordable, which is a rather loose term because one person's affordable is another person's unaffordable? And how much can SpaceX and Blue Origin do with, you know, the work that they're performing to drive down the costs of a ticket for a trip into space?
Well, SpaceX right now is flying payloads for roughly $1,000 a pound. Now, at that price, it would, just to lift my body would cost about 200 grand. I could stand to lose a few pounds. But how cheap could it be? Actually, Jeff Grayson and Jim Bennett put out a white paper called The Economics of Space recently, and they made a very interesting point. They said the energy cost to low Earth orbit is roughly 40 times the energy cost of flying from Los Angeles to Sydney, Australia. So you can buy a ticket to Sydney from LA for about $1,000. Theoretically, crunching those numbers, you could fly to orbit for 43,000. That's bare minimum energy cost. So you're not going to see that. I do think the day could come within the century where you get cost to orbit down to the cost of suborbital flight. But I'm not looking for anything much more than that. If it gets to 50,000, I'm going. But I don't look. I look to that for suborbital flight cost. Right now, the cost is actually going up. As I said, Virgin Galactic is raising their ticket prices, but after they get enough volume, it will start to come down. I just can't say how quickly that's going to happen.
Okay, and the last formal question I'm going to throw out at you guys is I'm going to ask you to all become something of fortune tellers and give me your estimate as to whether or not a space tourist will fly either suborbitally or orbitally before the end of the year 2021. So Cliff, I'm starting with you.
It could happen.
Now, is that 1 chance in 10 or?
No. Actually, I think that the chance of that is very high because, as I said, Space Adventures is planning to fly 2 tourists to ISS next year. I think that will, unless that flight gets delayed, that will probably happen. As to whether either of our suborbital contenders will make it off the ground next year, it could happen. I think it's fairly likely.
Okay, James, how about you? What's your view on a space tourist next year?
Given the way things go as far as scrubs and bad weather and whatever, I'd say maybe late next year, but more probably into the first quarter of 2022.
Bryce?
I would say probably around September, October of next year would be either one or the, you'd get for sure one or the other, I think.
Seth, what do you think the prospects are?
I share my colleague's optimism. Since we actually already have had a space tourists on ISS, I certainly think that one of the new space companies is going to make it happen in the next year or two. Ironically, suborbital still remains to be seen.
Now, just to expand on that a little bit, we're talking about, logically, you would think that suborbital would come before an orbital flight, but in this instance, it's because the orbital flight would be taking advantage of existing human to orbit, specifically to space station flight capability, and the tourist would just be an extra passenger on a flight. Is that correct?
Yeah, they've already had their vehicles built for them at government expense. That's the short answer.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to briefly share my screen here and go back. And say thank you to everyone. Again, this event was sponsored by the chapters of the National Space Society. And if you go to the space.nss.org website, you can go to our chapters directory to find out if there is a chapter near you. And that's, we've got it broken out by United States chapters and international chapters versus special interest chapters. Yep. There we go. Lastly, I would encourage you to consider making a donation to the NSS Chapters Fund so that you can help chapters in their communities undertake various outreach activities. And I've pasted all these links into the chat early on in the session. The URL is case sensitive, go.nss.org/I can help. So I want to thank you all for attending. I will be sending everyone an email who registered. It will have a link to the recording of our session tonight, as well as having all of the links that I had pasted into the chat in case you didn't get to them, and obviously for the benefit of those who weren't able to attend this evening.
Jim, one quick.
Yes, sir.
Our motto is Ad Astra. Would you tell people what it means?
The Ad Astra, yes, to the stars. And with the modification with the Ad Astra per Ardua, it's like through adversity or through our own hard work to the stars. And that's what the members of chapters aim to do. We feel that if people were better informed as to the benefits of space exploration, space science, space development, that they would take a more pro-space position on issues. For example, I don't know how that it's very widely known at all, but the scientists who had discovered that the CFCs that we were making, which were a great chemical for air conditioning units, as it escaped, it was working its way into the upper atmosphere, and radiation from the sun was breaking it apart, forming chlorine, which was destroying the Earth's ozone layer. The scientists who made that discovery had cut their teeth on studying the chlorine and ozone chemistry of the upper atmosphere of Venus. So the question I like to ask people is, you know, how long would it have taken us to make this discovery if we hadn't previously been studying the atmosphere of Venus? So space has certainly held innumerable unexpected surprises for us. One of my favorites being we went to the moon to find out how the moon was formed. Was it answer A, answer B, or answer C? Those were the three competitors. We actually discovered the answer was D, none of the above, but was instead F, an entirely new answer that had not been considered. And that being that the Earth had been impacted by a Mars-sized object, which split our planet apart and ripped off that material that went on to form the moon. I'm going to, even though we're over time, I would like to give each of our panelists the opportunity to make a brief closing statement. So James, did you have any final parting words for our audience?
I think that the future is going to be exciting. I don't go along with a lot of the gloom and doom types. There's a lot to be discovered in space, particularly the activities of the sun. And we just need to keep on keeping on. If we in the United States and some other countries that are more friendly to us don't do it, somebody else will. And so we need to keep on, whether it's a combination of government or private industry only. You know, typically governments cannot sustain exploration. They can only be the pointy end of the spear. And after that, you have to bring the commercial side up. Just real quickly, if you look at Portugal in the 16th century, Prince Henry the Navigator, their king, had a lot of exploration around the Cape of Good Hope. I don't know why, but they quit. And then the Spaniards took over. And then the Dutch, and then the English. So we just need to press on.
Thank you, James. Bryce, any closing thoughts for us?
Well, sure. So for those who don't know, there was a settlement summit back in 2019 where we had Royal Caribbean there. And so as we know, Royal Caribbean manages cruise ships and things like that. And they already have an adventure line series for the Antarctic, for example, where cruise ship or people pay around 30 to 50,000 a pop to go play around with penguins. They have already started making a space tourism division, and they have already started staffing it. And so, as they said, all they need is a ship, something that's at least maybe $2 billion or less to build, and something that can lift maybe a few hundred tourists at a time. If you do that, they'll make money on it, so they say.
Sounds like a new business opportunity for SpaceX's Starship. Clifford, anything you'd like to leave us with?
Bryce reminds me of my trip to Antarctica, and that's something that everybody should do also. Back in 1996, the National Space Society had a ground-based space tourism trip of its members to Russia to see, this was back when the Soviet Union was having its going out of business sale, and we toured Russian space facilities. And I remember standing in Yuri Gagarin's office and thinking back to the time when I was in junior high school, reading about Yuri Gagarin's office and thinking, well, there's no way in the world that I can ever get there because of the Iron Curtain and so on and so forth. So that ground-based space tourism trip back in 1996 has changed my ideas of what can and can't happen in my lifetime. And although I don't think I'll make it to orbit in my lifetime, I think the odds are still pretty darn good that I will see black sky on a suborbital flight, and that it will be cheap enough for somebody of my modest means to attain. And who knows, there may be possibilities beyond that. Life may be longer than we think.
Yeah, go for that. Seth, how about you?
Well, I was thinking about, there's a pyramidal shaped diagram that space tourism expert John Spencer, I believe, has shown, where the top of the pyramid, smallest part, is, let's say, flybys to the moon, around the moon, and then comes orbital tourism, then suborbital flights, and then below that, something like maybe a theme park, where there'd be a rover on the moon and you could pay a certain amount of money to drive it around for 10 minutes remotely. And then below that, your conventional theme park rides like the Mission to Mars ride at Epcot. And so there's going to be something for everyone. And over time, the pyramid, you'll have the same tiers, but the pyramid will get wider and wider so that you'll have a higher and higher percentage of people going to each of these tiers. So, and each will generally, each will enable the next step. And there may be a few in there that nobody's even thought of yet. And I think that there's a good chance all of these steps, all these tiers are going to be populated within the next 5 years. Now, how affordable it will be and how much, Cliff and I are about the same age. And so how much, we're going to be able to live to see it become affordable to us is another story. I kind of think Cliff's in the right ballpark that for a middle-class professional, suborbital flight is probably within the next 5-10 years. Orbit is a little further down the road.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for a great panel. I really enjoyed and learned a lot. That's a great thing about being the moderator. I get to ask the questions and you guys get to share all your wisdom with me, as well as our audience this evening. And for everyone who registered, I want to thank you. You all have my email address because I mailed you your Zoom invite. So if you have any comments or questions about NSS chapters or the National Space Society, please feel free to send me an email. And with that, I will say good night to everyone. Stay safe and have a fantastic weekend. Thank you very much.
Good night, everybody.
Oh, thank you. It was a pleasure.
And Fred, you can